right to vote was never handed to us. It was fought for, through Congress, amendment by amendment, in the courts, lawsuit by lawsuit, and across multiple generations. The Constitution didn't guarantee most Americans the right to vote at the founding. It took 4 amendments spread across a century to expand voter eligibility. Unfortunately, not all men were viewed equally when it came to voting rights. For the first 81 years of the Republic, black men had no constitutional right to vote. Then in 1870, the 15th Amendment said that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This didn't happen because of political goodwill. Frederick Douglass published the North Star, later named Frederick Douglass's paper, as a command center for the black suffrage campaign. He summarized the urgent need for voting rights in one famous speech. "We want it because it is our right. No class of men can be content with any deprivation of their rights." Even then, it took nearly a century before that promise was really kept. Women were not seen as equal for another 50 years. Previously, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She couldn't own property, keep her wages, or vote. After decades of suffragists, marching, and organizing, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote. Although the 15th and 19th Amendments gave voting rights to black men and women, they were often priced out of the ballot box by poll taxes. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, outlawed poll taxes in federal elections. It took a Supreme Court ruling 2 years later, Harper v. Virginia, to strike them down in state elections too. Lastly, after protesters demanded that 18-year-olds be able to vote since they were old enough to be drafted, the 26th Amendment was ratified in 1971. 4 amendments, one idea: democracy only works if everyone gets a voice. Despite these amendments, Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, and targeted violence effectively disenfranchised most black men and women from voting across the South.
We have found a pattern of discrimination in some sections of the United States, which have used literacy tests to deprive really tens of thousands of our citizens the right to vote because of their color.
In March of 1965, civil rights activists set out to march from Selma to Montgomery, demanding equal voting rights. On the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers beat them bloody while the nation watched on live television, a day that became known as Bloody Sunday.
This Alabama town will go down in the history books as a turning point in the civil rights drive. From the halls of Congress to the smallest crossroads hamlet, people can understand the plea that no American can have freedom and justice unless there is freedom and justice for all. In Selma, there is a lesson to be learned.
That same year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. It banned discriminatory voting practices outright and required states with a history of discrimination to get federal approval, or pre-clearance, before changing voting laws.
Today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield.
But amendments in federal laws aren't enough. While federal law sets baseline protections and can intervene through lawsuits or federal court challenges, it doesn't administer elections itself. That's up to each individual state. The Texas Secretary of State is the state's chief election officer, issuing guidance, interpreting election law uniformly, training officials, and certifying statewide results. Counties do the actual work, which usually falls to either an elected county clerk/tax assessor collector or an appointed county elections administrator. They handle voter registration, polling locations, ballot printing, poll worker staffing, and counting votes. The Texas legislature sets the election rules, voter ID requirements, mail-in ballot procedures, redistricting maps, and early voting windows, through the Election Code, which is where Texas Senate Bill 1 and the 2025 Congressional Redistricting Map both stem from. Many states, including Texas, are finding new ways around federal voting laws. In 2025, Texas gerrymandered congressional districts to manufacture more Republican seats. Here's how that works. Map makers either pack a group's voters into 1 or 2 districts so their influence is contained, or crack them apart across many districts so they never add up to a majority anywhere. Either way, the outcome gets decided by the map before a single vote is cast. A 3-judge federal panel found substantial evidence the map was a racial gerrymander, districts deliberately drawn to weaken one racial group's voting power, and blocked it. The Supreme Court lifted the block so Texas could use the map for 2026, while the legal fight continues in the lower courts. Texas has also made it harder to vote by mail, requiring an ID number on the mail ballot application and envelope under Senate Bill 1, a number that must match what's on file, even if a voter registered decades earlier and doesn't remember which one they used. In the 2022 primary alone, about 24,000 ballots were rejected over mismatches like this, not fraud. A judge struck the rule down in 2025, finding it disproportionately burdened voters with disabilities, but a federal appeals court reversed that ruling months later. It's in effect today, with more challenges likely. Not every fight is playing out in court, though. Congress has pushed the SAVE Act, which would require voters to show a passport or birth certificate in person just to register, effectively ending mail and online registration. The Brennan Center estimates 21 million Americans lack ready access to those documents, including up to 69 million married women whose birth certificate doesn't match their current legal name. It's passed the House 3 times since 2024 without clearing the Senate. In July 2026, Republicans folded it into the defense bill and are now pushing to attach it to a government funding bill. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice has sued more than 24 states over their voter rolls, and in January 2026, Texas voluntarily complied and sent our voter rolls. Voting rights groups call this unprecedented. Never before has the DOJ demanded confidential voter data from every state at once, and warn it's building a national database that could be used to purge eligible voters while exposing sensitive personal information to breach or misuse. Maintaining voter rolls has always been a state, not federal job. Much of the erosion of federal voting rights protections traces back to 2013, when the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder decision struck down the formula that decided which states needed pre-clearance, effectively ending that requirement nationwide, including for Texas. The strongest voting rights law in American history, the Voting Rights Act, is, today, a fraction of what it was. But none of this has gone unanswered. Courts have already blocked Texas's mail ballot ID rule. Judges nationwide have thrown out DOJ lawsuits for voter data. Despite a coordinated push, not one state adopted the strictest new voting restrictions on the table. That's not an accident. That's what happens when people show up, in courtrooms, state houses, and at the polls. Every right we've talked about exists because ordinary people refuse to accept that's just how it is. Texans included. This isn't abstract. It's your congressional district. It's your ballot. To understand what it looks like on the ground, we sat down with someone who spent over a decade running elections right here in Travis County, Bruce L. Font. Under his leadership, Travis County hit a 97% voter registration rate, the highest of any urban county in Texas.
How can I be assured that my vote is being counted correctly?
Well, there's several components to ensure that our ballots are accurately and securely counted. First is voting security. And election judges have a lot of authority to maintain safety at polling places. Weapons are prohibited in polling places. Electioneering is prohibited within 100 feet of polling places. Poll watchers can observe, but they can't look over our shoulders or intimidate or harass voters. And election judges can have anyone removed for violating polling place laws. The second is polling place security. First, while Travis County has electronic in-person voting, it's important to note that election machines are in no way connected to the internet. Election results, including electronic voting and mail and provisional ballots, are transported from polling places to election offices by law enforcement officers. Election data is locked away and monitored by cameras 24/7 that can also be observed online by anyone. Finally, the counting of the votes. Ballots are tabulated electronically and do include paper receipts that allow for manual recounts when necessary. Mail and provisional ballots are tabulated by bipartisan ballot boards and can be observed by campaigns and others in person or online. Election results may be counted and litigated in court if necessary. I've observed elections in Travis County for nearly 50 years, and I'm confident that adequate safeguards are in place, absent outside meddling, to ensure safe, secure, and adequate elections.
What has happened to the Voting Rights Act in recent years?
Well, in 1965, Congress passed the most sweeping voting rights legislation in our nation's history. Jim Crow laws such as poll taxes and literacy tests were eliminated. Changes to local election practices, including voter registration, the number and locations of polling places, changes to early voting, vote by mail, all had to be approved by the Justice Department. Congressional redistricting protected against political and racial discrimination, and violations could be easily pursued in court. Almost all these protections have been rolled back by a succession of court rulings. Poll taxes are still illegal, but the cost for some to obtain the proper ID needed to vote will cost significant time and money. Justice Department preclearance has been eliminated. Political jurisdictions have far more latitude to impose discriminatory practices, and court challenges are more problematic. Courts have ruled that political gerrymandering is perfectly fine and have made racial gerrymandering far more difficult to challenge.
Explain the difference between equal and proportional representation, please.
Sure. Equal representation means that each region or state has the same number of representatives, regardless of their population size. And the best example of that is the US Senate, where every state gets 2 senators. Now, proportional representation is allocating the number of representatives based on the population size of each region or state. So the number of electoral college electors, for example, are determined by state population and are allocated as winner take all, except in a couple of instances. The number of congressional districts are based on population. Larger states get more districts, smaller states get fewer districts. This was a compromise to protect the rights of smaller states. So the idea with proportional representation is that political parties and people of color should receive proportional representation to the number of votes. Unfortunately, gerrymandering is moving us farther away from this democratic concept of our founding fathers.
Can you explain gerrymandering, please?
Well, gerrymandering is the manipulation of political boundaries to benefit one party or class. In recent years, gerrymandering has become far more sophisticated and insidious. Districts are cracked to dilute political and racial representation and packed to minimize voters' impacts on surrounding districts. For example, current Congressman Lloyd Doggett, in order to maximize Republican districts, at one time represented a district that in places was as wide as IH-35 and extended from Austin to the Mexican border. Our founding fathers had envisioned that voters would choose their representatives rather than the representatives choosing their voters. Gerrymandering is nothing less than the majority party attempting to establish a permanent majority. The way to rein this in is by voting in large enough numbers to overwhelm gerrymandered districts.
Why do we rank so low?
Well, it's complicated. Partly it's that civics and schools have been sharply cut back. When asked, 40% in one poll said they were not even able to name the 3 branches of government. Lives of many are becoming more difficult. While voting could have a positive impact on their lives, for many, it's just not that high a priority. The idea that my vote won't make a difference due to gerrymandering and the perception of corruption is also a factor. There's also an apathy factor. People feel so removed from the decision-making in our nation. President Obama, speaking of voter suppression, said, "The voter suppression is a real thing, but it's dwarfed by the number of citizens who, for whatever reason, choose not to vote." So my response is that we must decide what kind of nation we want to live in. One where voters choose their leaders and the direction of our community and nation, or like authoritarian nations where there's no rule of law and everything is decided for us. Healthy democracies require the attention of its citizens. President Roosevelt said, "The only way we could lose our right to vote would be by not voting."
How do we change that? How do we get people to vote?
Well, my best advice is to print out a sample ballot and consult the League of Women Voters voter guides and any news outlets that you trust for each election. Complete your ballot from top to bottom. Many of the election outcomes at the bottom of our ballots have way more impact on our daily lives than those at the top. Many elections at the bottom of the ballots are decided by majorities of very few votes. And after all, the higher the turnout, the more representative the outcome. It's the right and responsibility of citizens to vote in every election. President Johnson said, "Without the right to vote, all the other rights are meaningless."